Continuing with our candidate forums, we'll be talking to Brian Shortsleeve, who's running for governor of Massachusetts. Mr. Shortsleeve is a Marine and entrepreneur who served as head of the Transportation Authority under former Governor Charlie Baker. Today, he'll answer questions from SPOA members and our panel, including media personality Mike Urban, who hosts The Mike Urban Show, news reporter Scott Van Voorhees, who edits the independent newspaper Contrarian Boston, and SPOA President Allison Drescher. As an organization, SPOA does not endorse political candidates. Therefore, this conversation is not an endorsement of Mr. Shortsleeve's campaign by SPOA. We bring you this information for educational purposes so that our members can get to know the candidates and so that the candidates can get to know us. But it remains up to you, the voters, to determine the merits of the candidates' positions. We know that housing will remain a critical issue for several elections to come. That's why it's important to stay engaged and to remain aware of the different ideas that people bring to the table. You can feel free to contact us once you've had a chance to see this episode in its entirety to give us your feedback. At SPOA, it's always our privilege to help make your voices heard. Hello, everyone. My name is Amir Shahsavari. I'm the Vice President of the Small Property Owners Association, also known as SPOA, which brings you episode 17 of SPOA Housing Policy Series. This is where we discuss property rights, housing policy, and all things real estate. I'm happy to welcome Mr. Brian Shortsleeve, who's running for governor of Massachusetts. Brian gave us permission to address him by his first name during this conversation. So, Brian, I appreciate that, and I welcome you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me this morning. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
As are we. Ms. Allison Drescher is the president of SPOA. Allison and I joined the organization in 2020 when we were both elected to leadership positions that same year. And since then, Allison has been a tireless advocate for reasonable housing policies without leaving property owners behind. It's great to have you back, Allison.
Oh, thank you for including me.
Of course. We have Mr. Scott Van Voorhees, a news reporter and a pioneer in independent journalism. He is the founding editor of the independent newspaper Contrarian Boston, and this is his second time on our panel. It's great to have you back, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Also joining us for the second time is Mr. Mike Urban, a media personality who hosts the ever-popular Mike Urban Show. Mike also has a background in real estate. And Mike, I appreciate you coming back on. It's great to have you back.
It's my pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who've been following the gubernatorial race as well as other current events who may not be familiar with SPOA, I will give you a brief introduction in a moment. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Brian, and I just want to see if you could kindly tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you're running for governor.
Well, I look forward to the conversation today. Thanks to the group for coming together. My name is Brian Shortsleeve. I'm running for governor. I'm a Marine veteran. Spent 4 years in the Marine Corps after college. I'm a government reformer. I worked for Charlie Baker driving reform at the T back in 2015 and 16. I'm also a business leader. I've spent most of my life since college out in the private sector, building small companies, helping them scale. I got a real passion for entrepreneurship. And I'm a dad. I have 3 teenage boys who I hope grow up in Massachusetts and raise families and build businesses here the way I have. And I fear if we don't get the state back on the right track, too many of our young people are going to be going elsewhere as they get out of college.
Well, Brian, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for your service and congratulations with everything that you're doing. For those of you who haven't heard of the Small Property Owners Association, we're a group of entrepreneurs as well. We champion the rights of all property owners throughout the Commonwealth, but we primarily focus on the challenges faced by the small mom and pop businesses who provide 65% of the housing in Boston and throughout Massachusetts. The organization got started in 1987 when a group of property owners came together to combat rent control due to the disaster that policy was and all the abuses that were inflicted on the business community. There are a lot of talking points that reflect why the policy was a problem, but among others, It made it difficult for owners to collect their hard-earned rental income. It led to the disrepair of properties, which also impacted the tenants negatively as well. It further reduced the supply of housing, which drove prices even higher for everybody, and that's what we're trying to avoid today. And it made it more difficult, if not impossible, to remove non-compliant tenants who were either willfully not paying rent or committing vandalism, committing acts of harassment against owners and other fellow tenants. And that brought harm not only to the owners and their properties, but also to the other cooperative tenants who relied on us to provide them with safe, maintained living places. What made things even worse was that property owners had to endure abuse and harassment from rent control officials and rent control boards that often refused reasonable requests for repairs. These boards also prevented property owners from collecting their rent. They would freeze the rent, and in other cases, they would even cancel the rent, while subjecting owners to very extreme forms of punishment for no reason at all. In one instance, a property owner who was tasked with repairing a code violation in his basement was ordered to lift the foundation of the house several feet up in the air. A lot of situations like that where these rent control tribunals would abuse the property owner, not only harming the owner and the property, but also the tenant, which has been a recurrent theme all along. And so in 1994, we succeeded in overturning the policy at the ballot box. And within a matter of time, the people who were still supporting it, mainly, or the people who were thought to be supporting it in the communities that had rent control, Boston, Cambridge, Brookline, about 9 years later, in Cambridge, which was the city that gave birth to the most radical form of the policy, they had an opportunity to pass a home rule petition that would have gone to Beacon Hill to reinstate rent control. And when that opportunity came, once they had years to see what life was like without rent control, they voted overwhelmingly by a margin of 61% to 39% to reject rent control. And I think that's a very important point that doesn't get reflected enough. And so we're in a situation now where that policy is back on the table, along with a lot of other policies that, taken together, will prevent us from selling our properties at a fair price, that will create unnecessary barriers when it comes to doing credit checks on potential tenants, along with other background checks. We're stuck, as Brian indicated in his opening, we're in an environment now where there are calls for more tax increases in an environment where taxes are already too high and too many. And there's more that we can discuss as the conversation continues. And so, even though we've been combating negative stereotypes, we are hardworking entrepreneurs. We're productive people who put our savings on the line. We could have invested our savings in other ways, but the point is, we put our savings on the line to provide other people with housing while providing jobs to many other businesses and industries, not just the tradespeople, but the banks, the insurance companies, the attorneys, you name it. We do all that. We make very meaningful contributions to keep our economy and our neighborhoods strong and safe. And that's why it's important to support us. Again, it's not an us versus them situation. We value our tenants and we respect them. But you can't have balanced housing policy without considering the needs and the challenges of the owners in addition to the tenants. We know that tenants are worried about rising rents, but on the flip side of it, and you don't hear this nearly enough, owners are faced with rising operating costs that are also unbearable, and they keep becoming more unbearable each day. And so that's why it's important to donate to our organization at spoa.com/join. That's www.spoa.com/join. We work hard to bring you this program along with monthly newsletters, email updates about pending legislation. We testify at government hearings for reasonable housing policies, and so we can't do it without you. So please remember to donate. And with that, Brian, when it comes to rent control, we're facing a situation where there might be another push for a ballot initiative. They tried to do this in 2023. to make it appear on the ballot in November of 24. They could not obtain enough signatures, but they might try to do that again this year for the election of 2026. And it keeps getting worse and worse. There are proponents who keep trying to water it down. They even try to change the name of the policy. It's not rent control, it's rent stabilization, quote unquote, or they'll come up with another way to package it. It's something that would be quite disastrous because, as you know, it's failed wherever it's been implemented. So I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts? Would you agree with our position as an entrepreneur that the focus should be on increasing the supply of housing to bring prices down as opposed to reverting to draconian government interventions?
Thanks, Amir. I'm a businessman. I've spent my life in the private markets. I know what it takes to build companies. I know how markets work. And I can tell you, rent control was a really bad idea in 1994 when it ended in Massachusetts. And it is still a really bad idea. You know, over time, in every market where it's existed, rent control, it reduces the housing supply. Often units are converted into other uses because rents aren't adequate to support development. Often you are also going to see units falling into disrepair because if you can't get a reasonable rent and a reasonable rate of return, you don't invest in the property. So I would say overall in every market where rent control has existed, it's a bad idea. It would be a bad idea for Boston and a bad idea for Massachusetts. What we need to be doing is creating more supply of housing. We need more supply. It's all about the supply side. Price controls like rent control always have the same effect. They reduce the supply of housing, and thus they're going to drive up prices.
Right. It could also have a negative impact on the average taxpayer because sooner or later, when folks in government realize that they can't collect the same revenue anymore, it's going to have a domino effect. Speaking of domino effects, Governor Baker was firmly against rent control. Governor Healy, on the other hand, at one point indicated that she too was against it. She said that rent control, in her words, rent control is just not the solution. But at the same time, at various points, she did come out to say that local individual communities should have the ability to implement it. And SPOA's position on that is that there's no such thing as local rent control because as soon as it pops up in one place, you have that dangerous domino effect where you see other communities getting impacted in the worst ways possible. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would oppose rent control anywhere. It's another expensive sort of government mandate. It reduces the value of properties. It will show up in lower tax receipts over time. But most importantly, we need to be creating more housing in this state. The reason we're not creating enough housing supply is costs are too high. Costs to build are too high. The stretch energy code in Boston is too tough. The affordability requirement at 20%. The result of all those things has been it's too expensive to build in Boston and the state. And I think rent control would exacerbate all those problems and we'd have less housing supply, less rental supply. So I'd oppose it anywhere it exists in any city, town, or at the state level.
Thank you. I'll now turn it over to Allison, who has a question about tenant right of first refusal.
I think one of the most dangerous policies that we're facing up at the State House year after year is TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And really, we seem to be looking at sort of a Groundhog Day scenario with the Massachusetts State Legislature. There's a lot of bad ideas that come forward year after year. What TOPA does is it requires owners to offer their property to their tenants to reveal their financials, to give a certain amount of time in order for a tenant association to be potentially formed. Therefore, really obscuring the marketplace and a fair market price between people selling their property and buying their property. And my question is really twofold. How do we, would your position be on something like TOPA, but also how do we engage in a more productive conversation with the Massachusetts legislature? It seems as though we're doing this spaghetti up against the wall approach, trying to solve this problem, but there is not a lot of constructive, meaningful dialogue between those of us, the tax base that owns property provides housing and the people making the laws. And I don't know if you might have any suggestions as to how a more productive dialogue along those lines might begin.
I think maybe having a businessman in the corner office who spent his life growing companies would be a good start. And I can tell you, like in my business, when I see a small software company we're looking at that has a right of first refusal in place, we don't even bid on it. We don't even look at it. Right of first refusals, or in this case, TOPA, are a killer in terms of the acquisition market, because no sophisticated buyer is going to spend money and time looking at an asset where there's a right of first refusal in place. It's also a clear violation, in my view, of property rights. And it's sort of the government artificially affecting the free market. The result of things like this will be less activity, values will go down. People are not going to buy properties in Boston or invest in properties in Boston if you have a TOPA concept or a right of first refusal. It's a bad idea in the real estate business. It's a bad idea in the software business. To have a vibrant free market to buy and sell assets and grow supply, you need to be able to move quickly in these transactions. Time is of the essence, and having things in place that give government the ability to pick buyers, pick sellers, and delay deal timelines always has one result, which is it kills the market, it depresses values, bad for owners, bad for renters, and bad for the city and the state, because the value of these properties will drop if you have a TOPA concept in place.
Thank you. Allison, did you have any questions or comments about the broker bill?
Another concept, and again, back to the original question, I mean, what we're looking at, I think, is stopgap measures, and SPOA completely agrees with you in terms of we need to build more housing. We seem to be legislating like it's 2019 instead of 2025. And so that is all making that challenge more difficult to undertake. But another proposal is to push the landlords to pay exclusively for the brokerage fees, adding yet another cost for the landlords. Any thoughts about also how do we keep real estate brokers in business, the system that has worked for a period of time, and now we have yet another governmental interference with the free market, which was working up until this point?
We need to get costs down in this city and in this state. We got to get costs down. We got to get taxes down. That is what will produce more supply. When I look at the city of Boston, since Governor Wu put in the new net zero stretch code, she bumped the affordability requirement from 13 to 20%. I mean, the market's in free fall. New residential permits are down 50%. It's become too expensive to build. So my view, Allison, this would be another example of something that's going to make it more expensive to do business in the city. And the result will be less permits, less new building, less commercial building. And those things are literally in free fall in Massachusetts right now. You go downtown to the financial district, there's no cranes in the air, vacancies are soaring, it's too expensive. And this is another example of government putting fees and concepts in place that are going the wrong direction, making things more expensive rather than making things less expensive, which will increase the supply of housing.
And earlier, when you mentioned Michelle Wu, we all know meant Mayor Wu, not Governor Wu. Just as a clarification.
I'm sorry if I said Governor Wu, Mayor Wu.
No, that's okay. Just in case we get called on it later.
Yeah.
It's all good. Mike Urban.
Brian, how are you, buddy?
Nice, Mike. Nice to see you.
Yeah, you as well. I've been following you quite a bit. I want your opinion on something here, Brian. What's your opinion on two items that I think are both simultaneously were enacted to support each other? On one hand, we have the MBTA Communities Act. On the other hand, Maura Healey put out this 50-page guideline called A Home for Everyone. And first of all, question one would be, we need more housing, right? But there's a lot of towns that are opposed to the MBTA Communities Act. A lot of people. I was at a convention last night and people were complaining about it. What are your thoughts on the MBTA Communities Act?
Well, I oppose the MBTA Communities Act, and as governor on day one, I would call for a full repeal. That is an example of administrative overreach. It's a one size fits-all type government mandate. It does not respect local zoning, local infrastructure. Everyone agrees we need more housing supply, but we need to be using incentives. We need to be using the carrot, not the stick. There are many communities in and around Boston and greater Boston that would love new housing, and that's where we should be focused. When I ran the T, we built multifamily units up and down the Red Line in Quincy. We had state and T land that we gave to developers to develop, but that was a win-win for everyone. The city wanted it, the mayor wanted it, riders wanted it. The state owns 100,000 vacant acres of land in and around Boston. That's where we should be starting. Take that land, the state owns it, the state can zone it, and put multifamily in areas where the community wants it. What we shouldn't be doing is telling a small suburban town that they've got to put 600 condos in their town center, which in some cases is serviced by a 2-lane road. They don't have adequate infrastructure. So I think the MBTA Communities Act is the wrong approach. There's a lot of other ways to create housing. I've done it, in my time at the T.
Yeah. So in your perspective, it's better to collaborate with towns instead of forcing things or imposing things on them, right?
And the government should be creating incentives for people to work. What the government should not be doing is imposing mandates. And with Governor Maura Healey and Mayor Michelle Wu, I see government imposing a lot of mandates on private companies, a lot of mandates on cities and towns. That's not going to make this state great. All of those things run against, I would say, making the state more affordable, getting taxes down, getting energy bills down. Because there's a lot of cities and towns, frankly, that don't have the infrastructure to support multifamily housing in their town center. We shouldn't be forcing them to do it.
I agree. I think that we need a collaborative approach between the towns, the governor, and state government in order to incentivize these towns. But it needs to be a unilateral approach, not a top-down approach.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Brian.
Local zoning has always been a core part of this state. Most of the critical services, fire, police, education, they're provided down at the city and town level. And I think cities and towns, should be the ones that make the call on those sorts of things, because they're the ones that are going to be paying the bills when it comes to building out infrastructure and schools and everything else.
Thank you, Brian.
Scott Van Voorhees.
Hey, Brian, how are you?
Hey, Scott.
Yeah. Hey, so jumping on some of Mike's questions, interesting observations on the MBTA Communities Act. And you're mentioning zoning. Can you really get at this problem, though? Like, in terms of the amount of housing that needs to be built? I mean, I've written about it. Other people have written about it. We're building probably twice as much housing in the 80s as we were now. And it's really dropped off. And even then, we were just average. So there's a correlation between drop in supply and, soaring prices. How do you get at that problem without dealing with the zoning? I mean, developers who are doing this, I'll tell you, they see this. They find the zoning to be very, in all the ways that local communities, and of course they're looking out for their interests. But they can be really difficult to build zoning and other myriad health regulations and septic regulations. It makes it really difficult to build. I mean, can you really get there without doing, some sort of zoning? The second part of it.
I mean, look, if you look at the city of Boston. I mean, the city of Boston is in free fall. You've covered it. I mean, when you look at the permits, we're down 50% from where we were 2 years ago. We've never been building less housing in the city of Boston. The city of Boston isn't even covered by the MBTA Communities Act, right? It's got nothing to do with the MBTA Communities Act. So when you look at this dramatic drop in building, it's got everything to do with costs being too high in the city. That's the net zero stretch code. It's the new affordability requirements. Interest rates don't help. But every single one of those things has made it too expensive to build. I mean, you're talking about those new codes are adding $25,000 to the cost of building a single family home, $100,000 for multifamily. I spoke to a developer in Quincy 2 weeks ago who said that in a new project he's working on down there, the state stretch code added $20,000 per unit. And he said, if I hadn't already had that product or that project underway, I would never do it today. You know what the electricity savings are for the $20,000 spent up front? He told me it's about $5 a month you're going to save in electricity, right? That is not math that works. You need to have a return on investment. So I would argue when you look at the dramatic drop we've seen in housing supply, it's got everything to do with too many state regulations on these things and too many things that are adding to the cost of building. That's what we should be focused on.
But you can't do it all in Boston, right? I mean, we had the suburbs. Those are small towns that nothing, I'm sure were beautiful at one point, but farming, was no longer a thing. And 50s and 60s, we had, significant development. And obviously, there's land isn't limitless. So you have to do something in the suburbs, right? I mean, you can't just say, look, it's all up
But
to
I think those should be, I
and-
think it should be incentive based. We should provide incentives to build, and we should encourage cities and towns to do it. Let me come back to vacant land. I mean, if you look in Metro Boston, the state owns 100,000 acres. Cities and towns own another 200,000 of vacant land. If you developed 5% of that vacant land, that's 100,000 new units. I would argue to you that is a much more likely path of success of building 100,000 new units than trying to get the city of town or the city of Middleborough or the city of Lincoln, trying to force them to build multifamilies in small towns that can't support it. What the state should be doing is focusing on all that vacant land. There's a lot of it out there. And I know you can do it. I mean, we built over 5,000 units up and down the red line using vacant MBTA land back in 15 and 16. So that would be my focus. Use the land we have, and out in the suburbs, let's use incentives. Let's be collaborative. Let's use the carrot, not the stick, because I don't think the stick ever works anyway. I think when the history books are written about the MBTA Communities Act, it will have generated a lot less net new housing than has been projected for all the reasons we're talking about. If the city and the state really goes to work at developing all that vacant land, that's a much faster path to me to multifamily.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I get your point on the incentives. I also wonder, as you're saying, one size fits all. It's very MBTA communities is very kind of like, let's build very large multifamily near, transit stations. I mean, people don't necessarily, a lot of people don't necessarily want to live there, right? I mean, they want to buy a single family home and they're moving to New Hampshire to do that. Do you have any ideas of how we could turn that around? Because that area, single family home construction has just died. I mean, the only thing that's getting built is really, $1 million up, homes that are $1 million or up. So,
well, look, 500 people a week are leaving Massachusetts. Businesses are leaving, young people are leaving. I mean, we have a crisis in this state around people and companies leaving. We just saw the new unemployment numbers for the state. We're now almost 100 basis points, 1% ahead of the national average. And the reason is no private sector job growth here. I mean, our economy has been flat. So I would tell you that when it comes to affordability, we've got to reduce the cost that it takes to build things. And that, to me, if I was governor day one, we'd be reevaluating the new stretch codes at the state level. We'd be reevaluating all the regulations Healy's put in to try to reduce the cost of building single family homes and multifamily homes. Because all of the things we're talking about, new state fees, new state rules, new state regulations, all it does is increase the cost to build. And if you increase the cost to build, you're gonna increase the cost of rent and everything else, because there's no magic money tree. Builders don't do this. Out of charity. They do it because they need to generate a rate of return. And a lot of these regulations and codes have just killed the economics on these projects. Nothing pencils out, whether you're trying to build a home or a multifamily.
no, thanks.
In addition to restrictions, which you talked about, Brian, we also have the issue of transparency or the lack of it. Recently, I think within the past month to 2 months, they passed an eviction ceiling law, which would allow renters to seal previous eviction records. Now, in theory, my understanding is that this was well-intentioned and it was meant for those specific renters who could not pay due to no fault of their own, but nevertheless, they still ended up with an eviction on their record. And my understanding of it is that it's not automatic, because the more radical activists wanted to make this automatic, but as it turned out, and as it was negotiated and watered down with input from the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, the tenant now has to petition the judge to justify why the record should be sealed. In theory, the property owner who was involved with the tenant at the time would have the ability to go to the hearing and have his or her say. But I think in practice, the question is it really going to be executed the right way? But even if it is, are we going down the wrong path? Because as much as we want to help certain people, as much as we want to give second chances to certain people, the overriding question is at whose expense? What about the business owner? A lot of us, the majority of us, operate at the margins. We don't have infinite sources of wealth. We don't have money growing on trees in the backyard, contrary to the stereotype. So we're at risk, and so a lot of property owners are concerned about where this is heading. So I guess the question is there a way to create a reasonable balance between protecting businesses while offering people who deserve it second chances?
I mean, look, that idea may be well intentioned, as you said, but I think it's a bad idea. And that's another example of the sort of thing that's going to drive capital out of the city. People are not going to invest in properties. To create an environment in which capital is going to invest, people are going to grow and scale. Landlords have to be able to collect their rents. They have to know who their tenants are. The government shouldn't be blocking them from doing that. If the government is blocking them from doing that, it interferes with the free market. And the result, like rent control, will be less supply, because I don't think you're going to find investors willing to put up money into new projects or existing projects with that sort of framework in work. Why would anyone, ever take the risk? Capital is very fluid. Capital can move. As we've seen at the state level, we almost doubled the marginal income tax in this state from 5% to 9%. 3 years ago. We haven't added a single private sector job in 3 years. Businesses are leaving, companies are leaving. We're not even on the list in Massachusetts when you look at states that companies want to move to. So I think these sort of policies have a very dramatic effect because they reallocate capital, they reallocate people, and in many cases, they're going to drive capital and businesses out of the city. So I would oppose the proposal you suggested.
Thank you. Along those lines, our constituents have complained about feeling left out of the process. When government comes up with proposals, they never consult with the very people who provide the housing. If elected governor, would you be open to the idea of creating, for lack of a better term, various commissions composed of actual people who are in the business to sit at the table with other stakeholders and to be included in the process of formulating reasonable policies?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, I've spent my life growing businesses. I'm a businessman. I know what it takes to balance a P&L. I know what it takes to create jobs. And we need more business people in public life. Maura Healey is a career politician who has never run a business. And I think you see that in her administration. There are not enough people around the table that understand what it takes to balance a P&L, what it takes to make the math on a project work, what it takes to grow. So as governor day one, I'd be trying to bring more people in from the private sector, because the private sector is what drives growth and innovation, right? If you look at a city or a state, the acid test of success is, are we growing our private sector? If we are, it means people are coming here and jobs are coming here. If our private sector is shrinking, it means that people and companies are voting with their feet, and that we're not a good place to do business. So I think day one, we've got to get industry, we've got to get business people around the table, because they're going to have a very different perspective. They know what pro-growth policies are. When you have a bunch of career politicians around the table who have never built a business or run a business or balanced a budget, you're going to get a lack of transparency, and you're going to get a lot of really bad policy ideas.
Continuing along those lines with regard to transparency, there was a very alarming report in the news recently where it was mentioned that Governor Healey allocated taxpayer funding to an extremist hate group. I think the group is called Arise for Social Justice. And Mike, you, in one of your videos, you commented on this too, but the gist of it was that they have publicly engaged in hate speech against police officers, calling police officers, and I quote, bastards. They called rental property owners and business owners as a whole parasites. which in my view is no different from a flea saying that to the dog rather than the other way around. And they said, whether you're a quote unquote landlord or a landlady, you shouldn't gender it. They should all be referred to as land bastards. And so these are groups that, for all we know, I don't know any of them, but having heard these comments before, they are very much against the hardworking entrepreneurs who do good for our cities and for our state. They believe that government should step in to take over the housing industry, all other industries. But point being, when you are, and when we collectively as a community, when we are faced with this type of extremism, how is it and why is it? And it's a rhetorical question. We can't all answer these questions, but I'm just wondering myself, why did the legacy mainstream media not cover this? Or at least they didn't cover it. Maybe Scott and Mike can weigh in. Why did they not cover it as it should have been covered? And what can we do to increase transparency to the point where we can stop the hate, we can work together and not give funding to dangerous groups like this one?
Let me start with this. Small business is the backbone of American capitalism. I've spent my life building small companies. If you look at this state of Massachusetts, 60% of people in the state work for small companies. And when we were a growth state, we haven't been growing lately, but when we were growing, all the growth comes from small business. So we've got to be doing everything we can to support small business and encourage them, make it a better place to work. And we got to be laying out the red carpet for business. So anything that is as you've sort of stated, making it harder to do business here, making it harder to be a small business operator, property owner. I oppose those things. We've got to be going the other direction.
Mike, Scott, Allison, any comment?
I'll chime in. Yeah, so I saw that, and I'll be honest with you, when I see these things, sometimes I'm looking at them, and I think if this was maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and somebody saw something like this, this would be on CNN. I mean, like she literally gave money. First of all, let me start here. I don't think that our state government should be supplying money or grants or anything of that nature to any like radical activist groups, okay, that are effectively in a position to, let's say, contribute to a small few instead of the greater good, right? Like there's only a small portion of people out there that are in line with those kind of views. You know what I'm saying? And for the governor, these are not like tabletop issues, right? That these people are advocating for. This is the extreme. And the reason that you're not seeing a lot of this on, let's see, legacy media and stuff, I just don't think that it fits the narrative enough. I mean, you see this very commonly throughout most legacy media here, is that, anything that could protect the candidates or the people that are currently in office, they will shy away from those things. And I don't think it's anything other than that. I really don't.
Yeah, no, it's there's a lot that doesn't get reported in the mainstream media, and that's why I started Contrarian Boston, and I worked for many years at the Herald and freelance for the Globe and other and worked at other newspapers. There's a lot, and I think a lot of the the real estate issues are covered in a very one-dimensional way, especially when it comes to people who own apartment buildings, and landlords, and people in the business trying to provide housing. I think there's a misconception that somehow they're printing money, and uh, a misunderstanding of how difficult it is to how tight margins are. Obviously, there's companies they're huge companies that doing better, and they have economies of scale. But for small mom and pop landlords, it's not easy. And I don't think the media reports on it very accurately, or looks at it from the dimension of you know uh, you know uh, from the tenant's rights, so to speak, perspective, as opposed to what are we talking about here? How hard is it to provide housing, and And of course, like in any industry, you're going to have some people that are, aren't behaving well and so forth. But that's any business or anything that human beings do, right? I mean, there's always going to be somebody. Um, so yeah, I don't think the media does a very good job and doesn't understand it or doesn't really put a lot of resources into it, and they have fewer and fewer resources to put into anything, right? So it's a wide open lane for Mike or my own publication to try to give a more balanced view of what the challenges are and I can't that story sounds very interesting, so I'm gonna take a look at it when we're finished here, so I think that's really interesting. I don't know. I can't speak for Healy. I mean, maybe I'm sure they give out lots of money, tons of money to different groups. You'd think there'd be some oversight, and there's some really radical, crazy groups out there. And I've noticed just reading through some of the literature that there seems to be this idea that the private sector just shouldn't play as a big a role in housing as it does now, or somehow we should have the government running it all, and that's just crazy. I mean, you think it's unaffordable now? Just wait till that happens. It would be completely unaffordable and nothing would ever get built. So that's my spiel.
Those are wonderful points, Scott. Yeah, people don't realize what's involved. They don't realize that it's a difficult business. Housing is something that's expensive to obtain, but it's also very expensive to provide. It's a difficult, challenging business. Enough people out there, they might think it's super easy. They might not. I mean, certainly they're not aware. I think more people in government should be aware. As Brian stated, there should be more people with business backgrounds who can shed light on these issues serving in our government for sure. And just to clarify, I'm not out to demonize Governor Healy. It could very well be that she was just not aware, but nevertheless, our leaders should be very aware of these threats and these dangers. With that, Mike, Scott, do any of you have questions about crime and or energy policy, whether it's the Berto Act or anything along those lines?
Energy is a big one, and Brian did touch on this a little bit. So, new energy policy in Massachusetts, when it comes to building, this is like a funny conundrum because on one hand, we want to build more housing, but on the other hand, we're making it less affordable to build. And, whether it be through energy and the mandates that they are imposing on new construction, or even inclusionary zoning, which we could talk about maybe in the future. But yeah, this energy policy for new construction is a big problem, in my opinion. I've spoke to many, 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 many engineers. As a matter of fact, that I have an event that we have to go to on Thursday in regards to this. So I feel like energy in general in Massachusetts, it's really a shame what is happening here. The cost of energy, just everything encompassing this New England region. Something needs to be done here. Okay, something needs to be done. And Brian, I would love to hear your opinion on, beyond just housing, but just if you feel inclined to talk about energy, do you have any plans on this? Is there anything that we could do to try to bring the cost of energy down?
Well, I've been all over the state in the last month and a half, meeting with families, meeting with business owners, and the number one thing I hear about is the cost of electricity and the cost of their bills. I mean, it's incredible to think today when you look at your bill that only about a third of it is related to the cost of power. And by the way, the cost of power is less than it was a year ago. You know what most of your bill is? Distribution charges, which generally have nothing to do with distribution. Okay, what they are state mandated carbon fees. So I was down in New Bedford with a bunch of business owners last week going through their bills, and there's 6 different charges now that show up in their bills. It's $100 a month, $1,200 a year. Those should be stripped out of the bills. We should not be asking hardworking families and hardworking individuals to fund these programs. And what I think we've seen happen is what used to be a couple $100 million a year program on all of these green fees has now become $1.5 billion a year, and it's all running through the utility bill. If the legislature wants to fund a program like that, they should find a way to fund it, but it should not be running through the utility bills of hardworking families, because it's creating an environment where it's too expensive to work here and live here. When you ask people, when you ask businesses why they're leaving, cost of electricity is always number one. You ask families who are trying to make it work here on the state median income, the electricity bills are a big deal, and we can solve that. I mean, a governor day one could strip those fees out, and that's what I would do, day one.
Do you think the legislature would give you any pushback on that, or DEP, or?
The governor controls DEP.
Yeah.
Governor Healy picked up the phone and knocked $500 million off that program about 8 weeks ago. And all I could think to myself is, why 500 million? Why not, 1.5 billion? These programs have to be evaluated for some sort of return on investment. We have to get back to the basics. We've got to be making the state more affordable, not less affordable. And this set of carbon taxes effectively and green fees you see in your bill is making the state less affordable. It's driving up costs. Every time we do that, we're pushing more families and more businesses out of Massachusetts. So I think that's a critical issue. It's a day one issue for me. Everyone cares about the environment. I got young kids. I care about clean air. I care about clean water, but we've got to do it in a way that does not drive families out. We've got to do it in a way that doesn't bankrupt the state and make it too hard to grow and scale a business here.
Thank you, Brian.
And I would say too, I think a very important part of the housing conversation needs to be preservation of existing housing, because the policies are going so far to use triple-decker housing as an example. In and around Boston, the most prevalent housing that we have, you'll have an owner occupant who purchased the house many, many decades ago. They're living in one unit. They have two, maybe a teacher, maybe a nurse. That's a big, huge part of affordable housing in and around Boston and Massachusetts. Those are the people who are calling us. They are saying that they can't afford to do this anymore. They're going to exit the space. So in essence, these draconian policies are also harming the affordable housing that currently exists. So that's a big part of the conversation that I think needs to be had, because not only are we not producing new housing, we are lowering the amount of housing that we have online for people.
Good point. Any other comments?
The only other thing I would say is that at every step of the way, Governor Healy has opposed affordable sources of energy like natural gas. We should build the natural gas pipeline. That would be saving New England families somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 a year. It's ready to go. Even the governor of New York appears to be leaning into it. That's an example. We need to have natural gas here. We need a lot more of it. And by the way, we should also be looking at nuclear. There's some amazing new technology on nuclear that didn't exist 20 years ago. That to me is the supply side of things we've got to focus on. And every step of the way, Healy's been an opponent on natural gas. I would build that pipeline, and it would have an immediate positive impact on families and businesses here in Massachusetts.
What would you do about the offshore wind project that's going and it's been struggling to get off the ground? I mean, what's your position on that?
Well, look, I always start with cost. I'm a dollars and cents business-oriented person. Offshore wind is by far the most expensive source of power by a factor of 3x. And by the way, wait till we see the new procurement come in. The new procurement that's out there will probably be even higher. So when I look at energy, we should be looking at renewables. We need natural gas. We need nuclear. But you've always got to start with what is most cost effective. And offshore wind, again, would be at the bottom of my list because it's way more expensive than any other source of power. It's also bad for the fishing industry. It's bad for Nantucket, where they've got turbines, washing up on the beach. So I think it would be low on my list for those reasons.
And you mentioned electricity bills. I mean, that's really, it's not just consumers, right? It's businesses, right? I mean, I can imagine we're not getting as much manufacturing businesses, other businesses that really, have huge electricity bills, right? They're not going to.
I met with a light manufacturing business owner about a month ago who told me that this is not when you're running a light manufacturing, it's not $300 a month. The electricity bill is like $10,000, $15,000 a month. It's real money. But
sure.
that is almost twice, that cost almost twice what it is anywhere else he operates, okay? That is unsustainable. if you are trying to have an economy with light manufacturing, with energy intensive industries, if our cost of electricity is 2 or 3 times higher, you're going to drive businesses away. And that's what's happening. Businesses are leaving, people are leaving, companies are leaving. So it's a big deal. You know, with businesses, it's typically taxes to include unemployment insurance tax, number one. Number two, electricity bills. And number three, cost of healthcare. Those are the reasons small businesses will tell you they are leaving Massachusetts, or at least not expanding here, right? They're scaling other places, but they're staying pat here. And the result of that is we haven't created a single net new private sector job in 3 years.
I mean, Massachusetts used to be a big manufacturing state, right? I mean, we used to even have an auto plant in Framingham. I mean, it's got to played a big factor.
And we were a big growth state. I mean, you don't have to go too far back to see Massachusetts as the fastest growing state in the Northeast, back sort of 2010 to 2020. I'm an optimist. I mean, I think we can get back to being a growth state that creates jobs. But if you look at what has happened in this state since 2023, private sector job growth, 0. Businesses are leaving, less new businesses being started, and people are leaving. I think we can turn it around, but we need to move quickly to get cost and affordability under control. Because I'd like to see us back as the leader in the Northeast, the leader in job growth, the leader in new company formation, a place where young people are coming to versus leaving. And I believe we can do all that, but it'll take a new governor with a much more business-oriented mindset.
What would you do with the T? I know you struggled with it, had some challenges, right? And I think some people might look at that and say, look, you know, anybody associated with the T, they might be a little skeptical, like, okay, well, I knew he ran the T and we know it was a mess, and how's it going to run the state? What do you say to people like that? I mean,
I'm very proud of what we accomplished at the T. You know, when Charlie Baker asked me to take a couple years away from my business career to step in and help him out, I mean, the T had stopped running under 100 inches of snow. It had a $300 million deficit. You know, 2 years later, the Boston Herald said I had taken an underperforming, poorly run agency and for the first time made it deliver for taxpayers and riders. The Boston Globe called the Fiscal Management Control Board and my leadership there the best thing that ever happened to the transit agency. Here's what we did. We balanced the budget. We got the Green Line extension back on track and launched. You can now ride from Leechmere to Tufts. We invested a huge amount in the new Orange Line cars, which, by the way, are phenomenal. If you haven't ridden them, I was on one of them 2 weeks ago. They were great. But, you know, the way you do that is you bring a businessman's mindset, an outsider perspective, and a Marine's determination to the cost, to the process. And it took us about 2 years to balance the budget and deliver sort of low operating expenses that enabled that to happen. And we did it while we got the Green Line extension done and we got all those new cars sort of coming online. So I'm proud of what we accomplished there. The T's always going to be a big project. The work never ends. But I think in the case of the T, what we should be thinking about for the next phase is really the commuter rail and ways that we can use the commuter rail to expand access in the state to parts of the state that are more affordable, because the commuter rail is the answer to the affordability question, because the commuter rail will get you out to parts of the state where you can still buy a home for a price far below what you're going to pay in Metro Boston. I think there's a ton of opportunity to expand the commuter rail.
Yeah. So where would you look at, or what would you do? I mean, in terms of commuter rail and.
Well, you know, the commuter rail, the right of way, the tracks are the tracks. So you look at what you have to work with. That's the asset. But if you look at a European model, which is usually best in class, you want more frequent service, maybe smaller trains. Imagine a commuter rail that looked and felt more like the Red Line in terms of every 20 minutes, you know, a train is coming by. The current construct of the commuter rail, where you might have a train every hour and a half, that's not enough to really get people, I think, out into parts of the state where it's a longer trip in. So more frequent service, smaller vehicles. There's a model for that, but that unlocks a lot of parts of this state where you can still buy a home for probably a third of what it costs to buy a home inside of 128.
And what do you think of how things are going right now with the T and, you know, the new general manager?
They've made really good progress on the Red Line slow zones, you know, which is great. I think from a cost control standpoint, though, what you've seen are skyrocketing operating expenses. I mean, the T has added over $1 billion of operating expense over the past 5 years and is delivering a third fewer trips than we were 5 years ago. So I think mission number one for that team right now needs to be to get operating expense growth under control. You cannot continue to add $200 to $300 million a year in operating expenses when you're delivering fewer trips, because it's not going to be fiscally sustainable. I think the team made out fairly well with the surtax revenues this year, but that's probably not a great bet long term. I mean, surtax revenues tend to be very volatile. What you're seeing right now is the results of a very strong 2023 and 2024 in the equity markets, because most of that surtax income is capital gains. That's not an income source I think you can bet on long term. So for the T, number one is to get operating expense growth under control and continue to focus on safety. I mean, the MBTA under Maura Healey had more derailments in 2024 than any other agency in the country. So I think, again, stay focused on safety, get costs under control, and don't bet too big on the surtax delivering in the future the way it has in the last 2 years.
On the subject of safety, when it comes to crime, keeping people safe, keeping properties safe on a statewide level, is there anything that you plan to do differently from the way it's been handled thus far?
Well, Maura Healey's been a big advocate of sanctuary cities. You know, I oppose that. As governor, day one, I'd be doing universal background checks on everyone in our migrant shelter system. Maura Healey does not do that. You know, she's running Corey checks, which aren't particularly helpful because they don't pick up people who may have committed crimes outside the country. So I think when it comes to law and order, it starts with the migrant shelter system, which has been a massive failure of her leadership. And it starts with universal background checks. It starts with a reform of that system. I'm a strong supporter of police. I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. I had a lot of buddies from the Marine Corps that became cops. I'm a big believer that we got to put public safety first, always ahead of other things, always ahead of politics, and I'd be a strong supporter of law enforcement. But with Healey, I think, look, it starts with the migrant shelters, it starts with universal background checks, and it starts with getting really serious about that migrant shelter crisis.
I could step in on that if I can. So we're spending, upwards of $900 to $1 billion a year on the front end cost of the illegal immigration problem that we have here. But that's only a portion of the cost, as you probably know, because when you look at things like healthcare, when you look at education, when you look at public benefits, a lot of people, I shouldn't say people, a lot of legacy media, I just reported on this, they're only covering half of the cost because it's the most, I think, compassionate maybe to cover the shelters and providing food and that for, people that came here. But it's, I would say, almost a 1-for-1 for front end and back end, and that's being conservatively fair. I think we're spending upwards of $2.4 billion per year on this problem. And one of the things that Maura Healey, and you know this as well, so does everybody in here, she says we're not a sanctuary state, but in practice, we are. And one of those reasons is because of the Lunn Act, right? And I know that's not something that you could just reverse overnight, but I think we need more cooperation, with the federal government in these regards, because, look at it this way. Legacy media will overplay their hand when perhaps somebody gets, arrested that perhaps is here legally or whatever it may be. But then if there's any kind of crimes committed, those just get swept under the rug. And there's a lot of families out there, because I speak to people within the shelters themselves. And there's a lot of back end corruption in those shelters between the no big contracts. So I guess I'll ask it. So do you plan on cooperating with ICE?
Yeah, day one, Governor Shortsleeve, the state police, we would cooperate with ICE. I would encourage all the local municipalities to cooperate with ICE, using every incentive we had to get them to cooperate. But look, there's no excuse for it. It's costing the state billions of dollars. I was down in Plymouth with Sheriff Joe McDonald, who's one of the few sheriffs in the state that cooperates with ICE. There's an example of a great leader getting dangerous criminals off the street. They're deporting illegal immigrants who've been convicted of crimes. We need to cooperate. It's a huge cost for the state. And when I'm out there talking to people around this state, they look up to Beacon Hill and they say, holy smokes. I mean, the state budget has grown by 50%, 50, over 6 years. This year alone, the state budget's up $4 billion. But it's not getting back to my community. It's not getting back to New Bedford or Taunton, where our schools could use renovations, our roads could use help. Where's all that money going? It's not getting back to cities and towns. For the amount we have spent, direct and indirect, on the migrant crisis, you could give every city and town in this state $10 million. That's 10 million bucks that they could use for schools, they could use to avoid overrides. So to me, at the end of the day, if we don't get this problem under control day one, we're going to continue to see an enormous amount of hardworking taxpayer money being absorbed. And the shelter system is being misused by Healy. It was never intended for non-residents. Came in 1983. It was intended for Massachusetts residents who are U.S. citizens who needed short-term assistance. So I would argue this administration has misused it. And there's no end in sight. Just this week, I believe I saw a number that we're still running at $3.5 million a day. So it needs to stop. It's going to bankrupt us if we don't get after it. And there's a lot of money right now at the state level that should be, I think, returned to cities and towns that is being absorbed by Healy's failure on the migrant shelter system.
You touched on something there that I want to, I've been trying to advocate for. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I'm quite positive it's around 50 municipalities, towns, whatever it may be, that are looking for budget overrides. And this isn't something that's new, okay? This is something that has been happening, but it keeps on getting incrementally worse, and everybody keeps on, city, town, municipality keeps on falling into that bucket. Like, I don't understand why, Governor Healy doesn't decide to step in and do something, because it's not like these towns are behind by like tens of millions of dollars, right? They just need something, some sort of help. And it's really surprising to me that she's letting all of these towns suffer and their residents suffer over, in comparison to what's happening with illegal immigration, amongst other things, right? These towns are like forgotten. And I talk to a lot of residents of these towns, and that's how they feel. They feel like, they're doing the best that they can. And of course, towns should be independent in total, but they're still operating under the bounds of the state. And I really feel like there should be a committee or something created, even if it's just temporary, to step in, and whether it's grants or whatever, whatever is the most fiscally responsible, to help these towns that are giving money back to the state to begin with, right? Like, I find this to be a massive problem that just keeps on getting worse and worse and worse statistically. So if something is not done now, you may have 100 towns in the next 10 years that are behind on budget, that are looking for overrides. And I just find it shameful. I really do. What
to me, it's a question of priorities, right? The state government has never had so much money. I mean, they're awash in money, yet I'm in New Bedford last Friday talking to a city council who told me that their unrestricted local aid hasn't changed in 15 years. So you're in New Bedford, you're in Fall River, you're in Taunton, you're looking up at Beacon Hill, which now has a $62 billion budget. I mean, that's up by $20 billion over 5 years. Where's all that money going? It's not going back to cities and towns. And I would argue that cities and towns is where the most important work is being done. Schools, fire, police. Governor Maura Healey has different priorities. She is spending billions on illegal immigrants. She's spending billions on hiring more state workers. And the result is a state government that is awash in money and cities and towns that are broke. I think we got to turn that around, because at the end of the day, it's all our money. I mean, it's all our money, and it's a question of priorities and where you think we should be using it. And I think it should be pushed down. And I think state government generally has a spending problem right now.
I think so too. And I think another part of the budget problem, I mean, look at Mass Health. Mass Health is like 43% of the budget or 40% of the budget. And it just keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I understand people need healthcare. I'm not debating that at all. But at what point, at what point do you step in and think to yourself, we have to do something here? Because if we project 5 or 10 or 15 years down the line, what is Mass Health going to make up 75% of our budget? I mean, really, I mean, something needs to be done.
Well, look, Gavin Newsom out in California came out 2 weeks ago and said that they're spending $1 billion a month on healthcare for illegal immigrants in California. And he said, we just can't afford it anymore. It has become too cost prohibitive. It was a well-intentioned idea. It started 5 years ago. It's exploded in cost. Now in California, what Newsom, I believe, said is as of the end of this year, they're not going to enroll illegal immigrants into the system anymore. They're going to impose co-pays because these costs will continue to explode if we have the wrong policies in place. And the result of that, again, will be more money absorbed up on Beacon Hill and less money getting out to cities and towns. And I think across the country, whether it's California or it's Illinois, you read a lot about blue state Democrat governors concluding that we've got to get these costs under control. And I don't hear much of that from Governor Maura Healey.
No, she hasn't talked about it at all.
Not a bit.
So
Thank
is
you,
that
Brian.
something you would look at doing then, in terms of the state Medicaid program, Mass Health,
Look,
in terms
we've got to get costs.
About
Yeah, I would look at all of the costs, right? We got to get all of our costs under control. And I think at state government, my experience taking cost out of an agency, I'm the only candidate in this race on the Republican side who's actually been in an agency as a reformer, taking out costs. The way you do it, it's every line item, it's every department, it's every week, it's a focus. So we need to do that in state government. And we need to really understand what is the full cost of everything that we're talking about. We got to go after every part of it, or else we're going to find that spending continues to go up. Taxes are going to continue to go up. Healey proposed 5 new taxes this year, most recently on your cable box. And the result's going to be that businesses and young people and families continue to leave Massachusetts. So I'd go after all of it, Scott, in a global way, every department, every line item, we got to get costs under control.
But would you go, it sounds like then, would you say, look, yep, this time's up. We're not going to, if you're not here legally, you no longer can take part in the program, or if you're already on the program, you would be taken off the rolls?
Well, look, I'd start with looking at it and understanding what the costs are. And what I would say here, I've not heard Healey talk about that. I've seen Gavin Newsom talk a lot about it. So I would start with what is the cost? What is it costing us, and move from there. But I think it's all part of the package, right? It's all part of being realistic at how we're going to get state government spending under control. Mass health is the fastest growing element of our state budget. As was noted by Mike, it's a $24 billion line item right now. You can't continue to grow a $24 billion line item at 12% a year. The result will be just this continued growth in state government and a continued departure of people. So for me, everything's on the table. We got to get costs under control. We got to make the state more affordable. We got to get taxes. We got to get fees down. That's what will bring people and businesses back to Massachusetts.
And I think on the housing costs, somehow in all of the costs associated with newcomers, with the shelters closing down, I think what all of these people are going to be transferred into housing. And what I think people may not be certain of is the fact that as the Section 8 lists for our own citizens, for veterans, for people who definitely need assistance in housing, they are waiting and waiting and waiting. And there may be a situation where the costs are escalating to provide housing for part of the newcomers to the state that are jumping the line, essentially.
Well, look, I would prioritize homeless veterans. I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. I care a lot about veterans issues. I care a lot about protecting people that have served our country. So I would start with a priority for homeless veterans. I think that's really important to me. And again, like, we've got to look at all of this because this is billions of dollars of direct and indirect costs. And as a state, it's not sustainable.
Brian, earlier in the conversation, and this is my final question, you described yourself as an optimist, and that does come across genuinely.
Mm-hmm.
And in the spirit of being optimistic and bringing people together, while giving the business sector, the private sector, a place in government, SPOA, I wanted to get your opinion on this. SPOA is working on a policy that takes the shape of a private-public partnership where owners could step up to help tenants on the way to homeownership by helping them make a down payment on a house or a condo. And under this plan, the government would, and they would do this on a voluntary basis using a portion of the rent that they get. The government would step in to provide matching funds. And if you had a tenant who wasn't interested or a tenant who was economically well off, you could put that into a different escrow account based on zip code, a public escrow account statewide, wherein you could help people who live in economically challenged areas and give them a step up towards autonomy and generational wealth. And people have come up with different ideas for what they call good landlord bills, which usually involve the landlords bringing the cost of rent down in return for a tax break. In this case, it has nothing to do with how much you're charging. It has more to do with what you do with that rent that you get. And in return for doing this, the government would give the property owner, the small business owner, a triple tax benefit. So for every $300 that you put in, you would get $900 back as a tax credit. On top of that, you would get interest-free loans to make repairs, which benefit your business and the tenants. And the whole gist of it, the whole goal is to nurture a collaborative relationship with government where the private sector can also be protected as well, where businesses can thrive, where tenants can become good rental housing providers themselves and treat their tenants well in the future. And in the process, one would hope that when tenants realize that the payment of rent equals paying towards their own future, they would be more motivated to pay their rent and to cooperate and to form that stronger alliance with the property owner. And as far as the business community goes, the private sector would take the lead in giving tenants that crucial future that they need. Now, provided that it's scalable, as Mike said at one point, provided that the math works out, would you be in favor of this type of partnership if you were in the corner office?
Well, public-private partnerships like that are a win-win. I think this would be a win-win for, for landlords and for tenants. It's an example of an incentive-based program, right? It's an example of a carrot, not a stick. So those types of programs are exactly what we should be doing. They're private sector based, they're market based, they're incentive based, they're collaborative. It's a great idea, and I would support it. And I think we need to see more things in government around housing policy that are collaborative, unlike the MBTA Communities Act, which is a sort of a one-size-fits-all administrative overreach type approach. So yes, I would support it.
Thank you. Thank you. Brian Shortsleeve, thank you again for joining us. We hope you'll come back again in the future. I also want to thank Allison Drescher, Scott Van Voorhees, and Mike Urban. Ladies and gentlemen, next month we'll be back with another episode. Until then, I wish you all well. Thank you.